Before dawn, 3 of King Charles's most senior advisers surrendered their security passes, cleared their desks, and walked out of Buckingham Palace in silence. They did not leave over salary, they did not leave over scandal, and they did not leave because the workload had become too much. They left because they believed the king's authority was being redirected by someone who had no constitutional right to wield it. And what they left behind turned a private palace crisis into something far more dangerous. If you want the full story behind what happened inside those walls, subscribe now, because this morning did not begin with a resignation. It began with a warning. At 4:40, the king's private secretary entered the correspondence room and froze. 3 sealed envelopes lay side by side, each marked for Charles personally. A private secretary is the senior official trusted with the sovereign's most sensitive work, so he knew instantly that these were not ordinary departures. They were coordinated, deliberate, and meant to be read together. The signatures were staggering. One belonged to the senior constitutional advisor, the official who guarded the legal boundaries of royal power. Another came from the director of royal affairs, who controlled the movement of the palace's most sensitive information. The third was the crown's liaison to government, the man responsible for making sure state business reached the king without interference. Together, they formed the barrier between private influence and official authority. That barrier had just collapsed. Charles read the letters in his private sitting room. He read the first page twice, removed his glasses, and placed them beside the papers with careful hands. The aide waiting nearby expected anger. Instead, there was silence. That silence felt worse. It carried the weight of a monarch realizing that the people trusted to protect his authority no longer believed it was fully his. Camilla entered expecting a medical update and found the resignation packet in his hands. She stepped closer, asked what had happened, and reached toward the letters. Charles pulled them back. It was a small movement, almost instinctive, but both she and the aide saw it. In that moment, a fracture inside the royal household became impossible to ignore. The final paragraph of the joint letter struck hardest. The advisers wrote that they had sworn loyalty to the crown, not obedience to an unelected substitute. The crown does not simply mean the person on the throne, it means the legal authority of the monarchy itself. That distinction made the accusation explosive. Palace officials immediately restricted the letter, terrified that even one leaked sentence could trigger a constitutional storm. But the most disturbing thing was not inside those envelopes. The 3 advisers left behind a locked red case filled with copied schedules, altered briefing notes, handwritten instructions tied to Camilla's office, and a list of state decisions they believed had been redirected without Charles's informed approval. A red case is used for official state papers, not office gossip. What they placed inside it was evidence. William was summoned before breakfast. When he entered his father's room, he saw the letters, the sealed case, and the queen consort standing nearby. He understood immediately that this was not a staffing dispute. This was an accusation against the woman closest to the throne. These were not rebellious courtiers seeking attention. They were the people who had defended the monarchy through family scandal, political strain, illness, and national mourning. They knew the difference between supporting a weakened sovereign and quietly transferring his authority to someone the Constitution had never empowered. Sir Alistair Pembroke had spent more than 3 decades protecting the legal boundaries around the crown. Margaret Ellison, Director of Royal Affairs, controlled the palace's internal flow of high-level information. Daniel Mercer ensured government correspondence reached the king intact and unchanged. None of them were dramatic people. That was why their departure carried such force. Margaret sat alone in her office before leaving and picked up a framed photograph of the late Queen. She had once promised that continuity would be protected through uncertainty. Taking the photograph felt like surrender. Leaving it behind felt like betrayal. In the end, she returned it to the shelf and walked away. Daniel found Alistair near the security desk and admitted that resigning felt like deserting an ill king. Alistair answered quietly that staying would mean helping other people speak in Charles's name. When the final security stamp struck their papers, the decision became irreversible. The alarm had been building for weeks. Schedules changed after medical briefings without clear approval. Ministerial documents disappeared for hours, then returned with new instructions. Meetings the king had already accepted were shortened, delayed, or replaced. That mattered because state business depends on certainty that the sovereign has personally understood and approved what leaves the palace under his name. Margaret had witnessed the clearest warning herself. In an account later placed inside the red case, she described Camilla's private secretary arriving with handwritten changes to a government briefing before Charles had even read the original. When challenged, the official replied that the Queen Consort was only protecting His Majesty from unnecessary pressure. Margaret understood at once how dangerous those words were. Protection had become the excuse for interference. William learned something even more troubling. One altered memorandum concerned the handling of royal duties during the king's illness. His own role had been reduced in a later draft, while language linked to Camilla's office had expanded. It was not yet an open transfer of authority, but it looked like the beginning of one. The three advisers did not resign because of a single uncomfortable meeting. They resigned because the evidence had formed a pattern, and one confrontation at Windsor made that pattern impossible to deny. Every crisis has one moment that later becomes impossible to forget. For them, it came 11 nights before their departure. Charles was due to approve a reduced schedule while recovering from a sudden decline in health. His physician had advised 2 weeks of lighter duties, not because the monarchy had stopped functioning, but because exhaustion at that level can distort judgment. William entered the room tense. Present were Alistair, Margaret, Daniel, the king's physician, and a government representative. Then Camilla arrived carrying her own annotated folder and placed it on the table before the official briefing had properly begun. She did not ask permission. She acted as if the key decisions were already settled. Charles opened the folder and began explaining which engagements would be postponed. Midway through the sentence, he lost his place. William reached to help, but Camilla closed the folder before his hand got there. She said the king had already approved the revised plan and that further discussion would only exhaust him. William looked directly at his father and asked whether he had personally reviewed every change. Charles hesitated. Then he glanced at Camilla before answering. That glance shook the room. It suggested that the line between his own judgment and the decisions around him had become dangerously blurred. Then Camilla instructed Daniel to delay a ministerial audience and replace it with a private consultation led through her office. A ministerial audience is a formal meeting where government business is discussed directly with the sovereign, so changing it without clear authorization was constitutionally dangerous. Daniel refused. Calmly, he said no consort could redirect state business without the king's explicit approval. Camilla answered that he would have to decide whether his loyalty belonged to procedure or to the king's survival. Alistair wrote the sentence down immediately. Margaret later identified that moment as the point of no return. Procedure was being treated as an obstacle. Constitutional limits were being recast as cruelty. Quiet correction was no longer possible. Before the meeting ended, Charles became unwell and had to be escorted out. Camilla remained behind, placed her hand over the official schedule, and said the revisions would stand. 11 days later, the 3 resignation letters appeared. By midday, the crisis could no longer be managed through whispered instructions. Camilla demanded a final meeting with the departing advisers inside Buckingham Palace. No recording clerk was present. No formal account was to be kept. I meant every word would later depend on memory and documents. The advisers returned only because Charles personally asked them to. Alastair entered first, followed by Margaret and Daniel. They expected the king to lead. Instead, they found him seated, pale and exhausted, while Camilla stood beside his chair. William arrived by his father's insistence and deliberately sat opposite the queen consort, not beside her. The distance sent its own message. He was there as heir to the throne, not as part of her household. Camilla accused the 3 advisers of humiliating an ill monarch and destabilizing the crown. Margaret answered that they had stayed until remaining became dishonest. Then Alastair placed his security badge on the table and said plainly that state instructions had been altered without lawful authority. Camilla demanded that Charles deny it. Instead, Alastair opened a folder and laid down 2 versions of the same ministerial memorandum. One carried the king's original approval. The other contained amendments requested later through Camilla's office, after Charles had retired for the evening. Daniel then revealed the most damaging detail. The altered version had already been sent onward under wording that suggested it represented the king's settled view, even though no record showed that Charles had reviewed those changes. William's expression hardened. Suspicion was gone. Charles looked at Camilla and asked whether she had authorized the alteration. She admitted that she had done what she thought was necessary to prevent the state from seeing him weakened. He did not defend her. He dismissed everyone except William. What came next? Explained how this had happened. Camilla's influence had not appeared all at once. It had spread through briefing access, private medical updates, schedule control, and staff who believed they were protecting a sick king. Temporary access became regular oversight. Her private secretary began attending meetings once reserved for constitutional staff. Requests to see the king were routed through her office before reaching his own advisers. Whoever controlled access could decide which voices were heard and which problems could wait. Charles admitted quietly to his son that late at night, when concentration was weakest, he often relied on Camilla to explain what was urgent and what could be delayed. He thought she was helping him manage strain. William asked whether he understood that state papers had later been altered in his name. Charles answered that he understood only that she was helping him. Even he could hear the terrible difference between help and control. William then opened the red case. Inside was a chart tracing 11 major decisions that had been redirected through Camilla's office, including ministerial audiences, appointments, overseas representation, household restructuring, and plans for temporary incapacity. The most disturbing note instructed staff to give William only essential extracts from medical and constitutional briefings until the king's position had been stabilized. A handwriting comparison linked the wording to Camilla's own annotations. William read the sentence twice. Then he found something worse. 2 senior courtiers had already signed an internal routing agreement accepting the restricted system. The structure had helpers. The resignations were not an isolated protest. They were the first visible break in a palace, already splitting into opposing loyalties. By the next morning, 3 empty chairs had paralyzed the center of royal government. Briefings stalled. Sensitive government packets were delayed. Senior staff refused to sign instructions whose authority they could no longer verify. From the outside, the palace still looked calm. Inside, everyone was asking the same question. Were they serving Charles, or had they become part of a hidden transfer of influence? The king's audience with the prime minister was shortened. William remained nearby in case his father became unwell. Camilla's office, however, was cut off from the private notes. That single restriction said what no palace statement yet dared to admit. Her access was no longer trusted. If you're still watching, like this video now, because this was the moment the palace stopped treating the crisis as private and started trying to contain the damage. Camilla discovered the change when a security officer removed her access folder from the king's desk, under William's instruction. She asked whether she was now being treated as a threat in her own home. No one answered. Then 2 senior courtiers submitted written statements confirming that Camilla's household had given them verbal instructions and told them to present those instructions as the king's wishes. One admitted he had not sought direct confirmation because Charles looked too exhausted to be disturbed. That confession exposed the core danger. Concern for the monarch had become the reason for bypassing him. Margaret left behind another account, describing a night when Camilla asked for a state appointment to be reconsidered, because the candidate was not personally reassuring. The appointment was delayed without constitutional explanation. Private comfort had entered official decision-making. The palace split almost immediately. Some defended Camilla's motives. Others condemned her methods. Charles listened until the noise became unbearable. Then he asked to see William alone. That evening in his private library, the king faced his son without aides, papers, or competing voices. For the first time since the resignations, he was not surrounded by people interpreting his weakness. He was simply a father speaking to the son preparing to inherit his burden. Charles said Camilla had supported him through pain, fatigue, and moments when duty felt physically impossible. William accepted that, but he refused to confuse devotion with authority. He told his father that private care could never justify altered state decisions or the heir's exclusion from essential briefings. Then Charles admitted the truth beneath everything. He had feared looking incapable. He had allowed more help because asking openly for support felt too close to surrender. William moved closer and told him that illness had not diminished him, but allowing others to speak in his name had endangered both his reign and his marriage. When William placed the handwritten note before him, Charles recognized the writing immediately. He had never authorized Camilla to restrict his son's access to medical or constitutional information. The line had not blurred. It had been crossed. Charles then signed a formal order restoring every constitutional communication to his official secretariat, granting William full access during any period of incapacity, and prohibiting the Queen Consort's household from issuing state instructions. He also asked that the 3 advisers be invited back, not to erase what had happened, but to witness the correction. Before that private repair could settle, the outside world found out. The next morning, Britain woke to a front page showing 3 empty desks inside a darkened royal office beneath a headline suggesting that the king had been served by men and women unwilling to serve the shadow around him. Broadcasters interrupted regular programming. Commentators explained the difference between a sovereign and a consort. A consort may stand beside the monarch, but does not hold independent constitutional authority. The palace tried to dismiss the resignations as an internal staffing matter. It failed almost immediately. Portions of the joint letter were read aloud on air, including the line about serving the crown rather than an unelected substitute. Once those words reached the public, the crisis was no longer containable. Camilla watched alone as commentators described her conduct as protection that had turned into unauthorized control. Crowds gathered outside the palace, with signs demanding that the crown speak with one voice. Charles responded before noon with a formal declaration. All state decisions, he said, remained under his constitutional authority, with William assisting openly during periods of illness. Camilla's role was limited to personal and ceremonial support. Public anger began to soften. But inside the palace, there was still one last reckoning. The final meeting took place without ceremony. Charles sat at the head of the table. William sat at his right. Camilla sat several places away. Across from them were the three advisers whose overnight departure had forced the monarchy to confront its own fracture. Charles thanked them. He said their resignations were not betrayal, but a final act of service. He offered all three their positions back under a new written protocol, requiring that every state instruction originate through the proper office, be formally recorded, and remain accessible to William whenever illness affected the king's duties. Margaret accepted only after receiving one assurance: no official would ever again be forced to choose between loyalty to the institution and obedience to a royal household figure. Daniel bowed his head. Alistair simply nodded. Then Camilla spoke. She admitted that fear had convinced her control was a form of protection. She did not claim innocence. Charles answered quietly that love could explain fear, but it could never justify decisions made in another person's name. He then imposed the consequence. Camilla's office was removed from all state correspondence. The two courtiers who had carried unauthorized instructions were dismissed. A review was ordered into every decision altered during the king's illness. She would remain beside him as his wife, but no longer near the machinery of government. William formally received the responsibility that had once been hidden from him. He would coordinate constitutional duties whenever Charles became medically unable to manage the full burden himself. This time, the arrangement would be transparent, limited, and publicly acknowledged. The three advisers returned, but the monarchy did not return unchanged. Charles kept the crown. William accepted the burden, moving closer to him. Camilla remained beside her husband. Yet the trust between them carried a permanent wound. There was no final mystery left. Three loyal servants had walked away rather than help someone else rule in the king's name. And by doing so, they saved the legitimacy of his reign. Subscribe, leave your thoughts below, and stay for the next story, because behind every palace silence, there is always another truth waiting to be uncovered.